Well, hey there, welcome back. So, what we started talking about last week was Paul in prison. And we're going to take a few weeks to look at it because it's a really interesting story, but it's an important story in the context of Acts because it takes up so much of the book of Acts. Paul spends really the last sort of 6 or 7 chapters slowing right down in his narrative and telling this story about Paul being in prison. And so there's, different reasons why that might be, but definitely the fact that Luke is really focusing in on this particular part of the story would suggest that at least for him, this is a really important part of his narrative. Now, it could be that when Luke is writing his gospel and he's writing Acts, it's maybe something of a defense. Maybe it's something of, just a defense of the faith. Luke is writing in a time somewhat after the life of Paul, probably in the 70s or 80s AD. And maybe by that point, the idea is maybe getting around that Paul was in prison. And so therefore that somewhat diminishes or somewhat undermines the credibility of the churches that he started. Paul had been deceased for quite some time before Luke writes this. And so maybe there's a new generation maybe there's some concerns about Paul, or maybe, whatever, maybe that, just the fact that he had been imprisoned and executed under Nero, maybe that is starting to raise questions about the validity or the quality of who Paul was or his message. So perhaps this is something of a defense. Maybe it's something of all right, let's go back to the beginning of the story, going all the way back to Jesus and showing not just how this church began and grew, looking through the life of Jesus in Luke, and then as we go into the gospel, into the book of Acts, we see how the church expanded. And one of the sort of foci of that, of what Luke is doing there throughout the expansion of the church is just to show really in part how innocuous it was at the same time as to how effective it was, how it really started from this tiny little movement in Judea and then ended up all the way to the ends of the earth, really all the way up to Rome. And so trying to trace that story, but also to show how Paul's sort of fits into that story, and then particularly focusing in on the end of his life and how or whether or not Paul was really guilty of what he'd necessarily been charged for, or really what he had been charged for. Everyone knew that Paul had been arrested and had been martyred, but why? What was the reasons behind that? And so that seems to be one of the sort of the real focuses of what Luke is trying to do throughout this story. And so the fact that he slows down so much on this particular part, Paul's arrest and his imprisonment, what is the significance of that? What is Luke trying to do there? And I guess even for us as well, just to give something of an explanation of, what happened to Paul. Certainly in terms of his arrest, we don't know what happened, at least from Acts, what happened to him afterwards. We know he was martyred through sort of records of church history, but we don't find that in Acts. But what we get is the story as to how he came to be in Rome and how he came to be under arrest. So anyway, that's what we're trying to look at here. What is that story? Like let's sort of unpack that story and really get some insight into Paul's life, and certainly how Luke presents that. So what we looked at last week was ancient imprisonment. And the first thing we needed to realize when we understand Paul's time in prison is that he wasn't imprisoned as a punishment. It wasn't that Paul had been preaching the gospel and so therefore he was arrested and sent to jail for a period of time as a punishment for preaching the gospel. We can certainly we see that happening in the world today, and has been for a long time. Prison is used as a punishment for preachers and Christians in certain places in the world. And so it's easy for us to look back on Paul and say, well, that was the same thing that was happening to him. But actually, in fact, it wasn't. What we saw last week was that prison is a place where you go to be held for trial. So prison isn't the punishment itself. It's a part of the punishment, but only in so much as it's there to keep you in a place. It's there to keep you from running away so that you can have your day in court. You've been arrested or you've been charged, and so we need to deal with you in some way, but we need to hold you until such time as we can do that. So that's what prison was for. And what that means then is that Paul's imprisonment was being held. He was being held for trial. And so that much we can sort of unpack from what we saw last week. But the bigger question remains, what was Paul in prison for? What was he actually arrested for? And again, we could easily default to say, well, he was arrested for preaching the gospel. And so in part, that's true. He was preaching the gospel and that was causing problems. But that's not actually what the charges were. He wasn't brought before Nero as a preacher of this new Christian faith. That was, again, part of it. That was what sort of brought about the charges. But the charges themselves, what were they? And that's really what Luke does so well to explain, but in the sense that it's really not clear what they were. And that's really the point. Paul was arrested, but for charges that nobody could really work out. He was in prison and about to face Nero, but again, we don't know why. That they didn't know why. They couldn't understand. No one could really get a clear indication of what that was, which seems to be part of Luke's narrative. It's the fact that yes, he was in prison. Yes, he was martyred. But when you look at the reasons for it, Paul was actually innocent. There was actually no real clear charges that had ever been laid against him. So this is what the narrative seems to be sort of trying to point out to his initial readers and still for us today. So again, the question is, what was that? And it's just an interesting story. I think it's just personally very interesting. So hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. But what we're trying to look at then is what that whole story was and how it came to be that Paul was charged and imprisoned in the first place. All right, so the fact that it's a long narrative in Acts is in part because it actually took quite a few years for this story to unfold. Paul was ultimately in prison for about 4 years, and the process of this began obviously a long time before we get to the end of the story, but the beginnings of the story actually go back into Jerusalem. So when Paul finishes his third missionary journey, and that third missionary journey took place between sort of around 53 to 56 AD, thereabouts. And so that was when he'd spent about 3 years in Ephesus, and he was doing a lot of church planting and sending church planters out. And so that's a whole nother story. But Paul had finished that journey, and his intention at that point was to go to Rome. If you follow the narrative of Paul's life, his ultimate goal is always to get to Rome. Paul took very seriously the commission to take this gospel to the ends of the earth. And so what he needed to do was to get to Rome, but actually not just to stop in Rome, but to ultimately get to Spain. So Rome, as far as Paul was concerned, was going to be a launching pad for him to go to Spain, which in the understanding of the ancient world was actually the ends of the earth. Spain is obviously on the edge of Europe, and as far as everyone was concerned in that time, Europe was the end of the earth. They hadn't discovered America yet. And so Paul's goal was to get to Spain, but first to get to Rome so as to, encourage that church, but ultimately to use them as a launching pad to get to literally the ends of the earth and so hopefully usher in the return of Jesus. At least that's his plan. But before he does that, he wants to go back to Jerusalem. So it's the end of his third missionary journey, and his goal is to get to Rome, but first thing he needs to do is get back to, home base, back in Jerusalem, because the other thing that he's been doing over these last few years is taking up an offering. So there's this offering that he's been collecting for the Christians back in Jerusalem. And there's a couple of reasons for this offering. Number one is to actually bring practical support to the Christians, back in Jerusalem. They've been suffering persecution. There've been some famines. There's been some various challenges that they've been facing. And so what Paul's been doing throughout the Gentile churches that he's been ministering to or starting is taking up an offering of just practical support for those Christians back there. But in addition to that is to build a bridge of friendship between the Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem, and then also the Gentile Christians out in the wider world. And part of this is because there's always, you see a lot of tensions in the early church between the Jewish and the Gentile Christians. There's a sort of a bit of a skepticism amongst some of the Jewish Christians that Gentiles, do they really fit? We've never associated with them before now, so how can we so easily do that now? And just because, they're in Christ, is that sufficient? So there's different reasons for that, but what it boils down to is that Paul needs to show these Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem that these Gentiles that he's been preaching to are every bit as much the people of God as the Jewish Christians, and more than that, just to put their money where their mouth is. It's easy to say, oh, they're our brothers and sisters in Christ. Well, no, prove it. Actually put your money where your mouth is and show that you're part of the family. And so there's a sense of trying to build bridges, to build maybe some reconciliation between the Jews and the Gentiles, which has also been another sort of key part of Paul's ministry, as he talks about in Ephesians and Colossians. Part of his role in preaching to the Gentiles is to sort of help tear down that dividing wall between, again, Jews and Gentiles. Anyway, I get beside the point. So this is what the offering is there for, and what Paul wants to do is to bring that back to Jerusalem, and then from there, pretty much probably finish his time. As far as he's concerned at that point, he's going to go to Spain, and that's pretty much going to be the end. That's probably where he's going to finish up the rest of his life. The thing to remember is that at this point, Paul's probably around 60 years old, which doesn't sound that old by today's standards, but in the ancient world, that's very, very old. I mean, that's really geriatric at that point. To live to 60 is pretty rare. And so the fact that Paul's got that far, particularly when you consider the amount of physical trials that he's been through, it's kind of extraordinary that anyone to live to that age, let alone someone who's been through what Paul's been through. Nevertheless, he's getting towards a point where most people don't live anymore. And so he's, at least in his mind, thinking, well, he's going to go to Spain, and that's going to be where he's going to finish up. He'll spend a few years there if he's got a few years left in him, and there's probably no sense in his mind that he's going to come back to Jerusalem. And so this would be his last visit, almost the farewell tour, go back to Jerusalem, and to be a place where he spent a lot of his adult life, as being trained as a Pharisee and then as a Pharisee later on. So it's going back to the core, going back to, sort of home base in terms of the early church, bring the offering, probably just brief everybody on what he's been doing, whatever needs to happen there, and then head off to Spain. So that's the plan for now. He's finished the third journey. He ends up back in Jerusalem with this sort of future planning in mind. But it doesn't work out the way that he anticipates. And so this is where Luke sort of picks up the story in the book of Acts. So we're going to look at a lot of text here throughout this series, because there's just a lot in Luke's description in Acts. So we're going to pick it up in Acts 21:17. Now this time, just to give you a sense of the timing here, we're probably looking at about the sort of 56, 57 AD. So about the winter of that period. So he's finished the third journey, the year 56, back in Jerusalem, somewhere sort of in that 56, 57 time frame. Remember, in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, winter is through December, January. So he's back now in Jerusalem about this time. And so Luke says in 21:17, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done amongst the Gentiles through his ministry. So he goes back to see James. Why James? Well, James is the head of the church. Now, this isn't James the disciple. This is James, the brother of Jesus. So at some point early on, James has sort of taken on the mantle of becoming the head of the church. The James of the James the disciple, that's sort of a whole nother story. We actually see him being martyred early on in the book of Acts. So this is the brother of Jesus, the same one that writes the letter later on under the name of James. So James is the head of the church, and Paul's priority, of course, going back to Jerusalem, is to check in with James, right? He's coming back to report on his work as that he's done in the name of Christ, and so naturally he's going to go back, and of course just to catch up with James, right? Just to check in and see how everything's going back there, and in doing that, of course, to bring the offering. James will be the one who'll be responsible for distributing that offering, and so naturally all of that is going to be done through him. And so naturally that's the first point of call that Paul's going to make. So he goes back and sees him. So he picks up in verse 20. He says, this is James talking now. He says, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live amongst the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So what we've got here is the indication of the early tension and what is going to escalate to ultimately bring Paul to be arrested. It all begins here. And what's going on is that Paul, over the last 10 or 15 years, has been out preaching to the Gentile world. And at the core of his message is that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. That's really the whole point of his message. And this is why he's an apostle to the Gentiles, is that he's out there and he's sort of reinterpreted or re-understood the the position or the requirement for Gentiles to come to become the people of God. It had always been that to be the people of God, you need to be circumcised, observe Sabbath, observe kosher, and these sort of things. And what Paul has come to realize is that for the Gentiles to become Christians, they don't have to do that, or to become the people of God. They don't have to do that. They don't have to go through those Jewish rituals, because that was the old covenant. That was what was required to be Jewish, to be the people of God. Now in the new covenant, we've got the Spirit. We don't need all of these other physical marks or certain behaviors anymore. We've got the Spirit instead. What the Spirit does is that he marks us out as being God's people, but also transforms us, transforms our behavior in a much deeper way than just simply, don't do this or do that. It's a total transformation. It's a total sort of renewal to become more Christ-like. And so that's the whole point of Galatians. That whole letter is about dealing with this contention that's arisen early on in Paul's ministry, and really writing against Jewish Christians who are saying that for Gentiles to be Christians, you have to go through all these procedures. Yeah, Christ has saved you, but he hasn't finished the job. You need to finish that through circumcision. So this has been an argument that's going on really from very, very early on in Paul's ministry. And it's also been a problem for the general Jewish population wherever he goes, is because he's going into the world now as a representative of Judaism, of being Jewish, and saying you don't need to do these things anymore to be the people of God. And so this is just putting off not just the Orthodox Christian Jews or the sort of the Jewish Christians who are still law-abiding, but just Jews in general. And so this, again, it's a tension that Paul's had all the way through. Every point in Acts, every city he turns up to, all through his letters, we see this tension playing out. And so that has always sort of been feeding back to Jerusalem, coming back to the main authorities. And so Paul has a black mark against his name. Paul is public enemy number one as far as many Jews are concerned, because he's an apostate. He's not a true representative of Judaism. He's not a true representative of the people of God. He's an apostate who's preaching a false gospel or preaching heresy and talking about a way of being the people of God that, as far as the Jews were concerned, is really quite blasphemous. So this is a huge, huge problem that is going on, and it's particularly an issue back in Jerusalem. Paul's reputation back there is quite obviously pretty bad, and there's been a lot of speculation, a lot of rumor that's been spread about him back there because of what he's been doing out in the Gentile world. But even more broadly than that, there's a constant tension going on between Jewish Christians and the Orthodox Jewish community. The Jewish Christians who are accepting Paul's message are saying, well, we don't need to do those things anymore. Those things aren't essential to being part of the people of God. And so they're starting to not dilute, but they're recognizing that all of these things we used to do in order to be the people of God, that is to be Jewish, are not essential anymore. And so, to be a Christian simply means to have the Spirit, to have faith in Christ, and that's it. That's all that's required. And so there's a tension that is already happening between the two communities. And this is particularly playing out in Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem is obviously the spiritual heartland of the Jewish faith. And so what you're getting in Jerusalem are Jews who are becoming Christians. And that's a major issue. That's a major point of contention, because by becoming Christian, you're turning your back on the traditions. You're turning your back on the faith that is holding these people together, your people together, and you yourself have become an apostate. This has always been a problem, and this all the way back to the early chapters of Acts. Think about Paul back when he was a persecutor. Why was he persecuting these Christians? Well, because they were saying that you don't need to do these things anymore, that Christ is enough. And Paul Saul deemed them to be apostates, and so was persecuting them. So in order for Christianity to survive, or at least for the Jewish Christians and the Orthodox Jews to be able to at least live in something of a harmony in Jerusalem, in that heartland, we need to find some sort of compromise. We need to find a way of being able to live together so that we don't kill each other, or that specifically you don't persecute us to the point of death. And so what James had been able to do, and this is what James was really recognized for, was the fact that he was a very diplomatic leader. And even when Josephus talks about him later on, he recognizes him as being a very effective leader in the sense that he was able to find a middle ground between these communities, at least in Jerusalem, between the Orthodox Jews and the Christian Jews, finding a middle ground that was enabled them to at least live within some place of at least less tension. And what that compromise would have looked like would have been that the Jewish Christians would still observe the Jewish customs. They would still circumcise their children, observe the Sabbath, observe kosher, do the things that they've always done culturally, but not attribute to that a means of salvation. They wouldn't look at that and say, well, we are the people of God, or they wouldn't say we're Christian because we do these things. We're Christians because we have faith in Christ, but we're doing these things anyway because, well, it's just what we've always done. It doesn't impact our faith. It doesn't impact our standing with God, whether we do this or not. But what it does do is that it still endears us. It still helps us to fit in to the broader community. And so it's more of a cultural practice that they're continuing, and understanding it in that way, what that means is that you can at least live in some sort of sense of harmony. There's still a recognition that the law is still valid, and that to be the people to at least be culturally Jewish, these things are still valid, but they're not essential. Is really the sort of the position that they've come to. And so this is who Luke's describing when he says that many thousands of Jews who have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They've found this compromise, this middle ground, where they've come to the faith, and there's many thousands of them as far as James is concerned, but they're also observant of the law to the extent that it's a cultural observance. And so they're still maintaining their Jewishness whilst and also embracing this new Christian faith. Now, that's fine. That works well in Jerusalem amongst the Jews, and it enables families not to be ripped apart by this Christian faith. It enables the communities not to be ripped apart and the synagogue communities not to be ripped apart. But it's also easy to do when all of the population is Jewish, right? You don't have a large population of Gentiles in Jerusalem. And so when everybody's Jewish, it's a way of sort of finding a middle ground where we can still all get along and be Jewish, but where we differ is over our belief in Christ. We say that Christ is the Savior. We say that he's the Messiah, whereas others don't. That's the only point of contention. But for the rest of it, we're happy to make that compromise and live as we always have as Jewish people. So all of that's perfectly fine. But that doesn't work out in the Gentile world. That doesn't work because what that requires is that all of these Gentiles who are now Christian, now to come into the faith, but to also have to become Jewish, that's an entirely different thing. So what these Christians are sort of faced with, the ones back in Jerusalem, is this challenge. Well, Paul's been out there sort of advocating for a way of life or a way of Christianity that is somewhat in contrast to what we're doing, in so much as he's saying, well, you guys that are Christians, you Gentiles, don't have to do these Jewish customs. And so all of that's good and well. And that's what, again, Galatians, Romans, all these letters are sort of dealing with in showing how Gentiles don't need to observe those practices. But what's happened back in Jerusalem is that what Paul is actually preaching has been distorted to say that he's actually preaching against Moses. He's saying you've got to reject Moses, and particularly the rumor is that he's saying that to the Jewish people. You Jews have to reject the law, and really has completely turned away from Torah altogether. At least that's what the accusation is against Paul. And so that's been fostering, and that's really has certainly helped to make Paul public enemy number one, at least as far as the Jews in Jerusalem are concerned, because he's out there basically rejecting Judaism. He's rejecting Jewishness altogether and saying that Moses is wrong and all of these accusations that are being made. So that's going to be a problem. Now, it's fine to have all of those accusations about you being spread around Jerusalem, because if you're not there, it doesn't matter. Right? If you're off in Corinth or up in Rome or something, and they're saying these things bad about you in Jerusalem, well, they're going to say bad things about you anyway. Who cares what they're saying down there? There's nothing I can do about it. That's just how it's going to be. That's all fine until you get there. Now that you're there, well, this is a problem now, because, well, public enemy number one has just turned up. What's even worse than that is that the first person Paul goes and sees is James. James is the head of the church and also the mediator between the Christians, the Jewish Christians and Orthodox Jews. He's found this very tenuous balance between the communities that's enabled them to sustain something of a sort of a comfortable tension. Paul returning is bad enough for one that he's back, but the fact that he's going and staying with James is just to throw petrol on the fire. Because if Paul's turned up and he's staying with James, what is that saying about James? Well, he's endorsing this message of Paul. And this message about Paul is that he's beyond an apostate. He's rejecting Moses. He's basically saying, tear up your Torahs. And so if James hosts Paul, brings him into his house, hosts him and endorses him, well, by doing that, he's endorsing him and saying that all of that's okay. So James is in a real bind here. Just to even have Paul in town is bad enough because of the inevitable tension that's going to cause. But to have him come and be with James is going to make matters even worse. And so James is trying to find a way to bring something of a not a reconciliation, but at least try to mitigate some of the tension that this is inevitably going to cause. And so what James encourages Paul to do is to participate in a purification rites. Or there's a couple of young men who are looking to purify themselves go through a certain ritual purification. And so they say to Paul, why don't you do that as well, do the same procedure that these guys are doing, and show everybody that you still uphold the law, that you are still a participant in the law, that you're not rejecting Moses, all of those things. If you do something very, very Jewish, you're saying to everybody else that you haven't rejected the law, and this might put an end, at least to some degree, put an end to these rumors that have been spread, and certainly to help mitigate the inevitable questions and tension that are going to arise by you being back, and particularly about you staying here. So Paul says, yeah, that's fine. That makes sense. And so he goes ahead and he does that. And this is a 7-day ritual that he's participating in. And the basic point of the ritual is purification. It's before you go to the temple, you need to be purified. And so that's what these guys are trying to do. And so Paul participates in all of that. Everything's going well. There's been no issues so far until we get to the end of Acts 21. So verse 27 says, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, men of Israel, this is the man who has been teaching everywhere against the people and against the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. What's happening here is that Paul he's just wandering around Jerusalem. Probably more and more people are starting to realize that he's there, but he's taking part in this purification. And so they see him going into the temple, and it says there that there's some Jews from Asia. Now, it's interesting that Luke specifies that it's some Jews from Asia, not just local residents, but Jews who are down from Asia. Now, where has Paul just been? Well, he spent the last couple of years in Ephesus, which is Asia Minor. He's been in Asia for the last couple of years and would be very well known to the Jewish community there. They've already kicked him out of the synagogue early on when he arrived, but he was public enemy number one in Ephesus as well amongst the Jews. And so some of these guys have come down to Jerusalem, and that would be pretty standard. You come down for the festivals, and that's what they're down here for at this point. And so they've seen Paul and they've recognized him, and so now they've got their opportunity to turn against him, to raise some trouble against him, because, you know, they're amongst friends down in Jerusalem. And so it would be very easy for them to be able to stir up a crowd in order to be able to, you know, to have Paul brought into, at least for questioning or whatever the outcome may be. And so again, you hear the accusations, these sort of false charges that have been kind of lumped against Paul. You know, he's teaching everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Basically, he's just rejecting everything about Judaism. This is an apostate of the worst kind. Here he is, he's in town. And even worse than that, they say, he's brought a Gentile into the temple. Not just that Paul has gone into the temple, he's brought an actual Gentile into there with him. Now, there's a specific element to this charge. Now, Gentiles are welcome into the temple. In fact, there's a whole outer courtyard. If you look at a map or if you look at a diagram of the temple, there's a whole outer courtyard called the Court of the Gentiles. This is where Gentiles can come in. And the purpose of the temple is for all people to be able to come in to meet Yahweh. So you've got this Court of the Gentiles. Now, what had been happening back in Jesus' time was that this court was being used for trading. It was being basically turned into a marketplace. Rather than a place where Gentiles could come and worship, it had been turned into shops. So when Jesus comes in, he's infuriated. He kicks over all the tables because this place has been turned into a marketplace rather than a house of prayer for all the nations. So it was violating the original purposes of this. But the problem wasn't that Paul was bringing a Gentile into the temple. They were perfectly welcome into that area, but there was an inner sanctuary which was only for Jewish people. That only Jewish, and specifically only Jewish men, could come into the inner sanctuary of the temple. In fact, there was a sign outside it that's above the gate outside this area that said, Gentiles are forbidden on the pain of death. And so this, in fact, was one of the only situations in which the Jewish authorities could actually execute somebody is if they came into this area. So this sign is written in Hebrew, also in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, as a warning to anybody that if you're a Gentile and you come in here, you face death. That's the only time that the Jews could get away with a capital punishment, and it was in this area. So what they're actually accusing Paul of is bringing a Gentile into that space. Now, number one, it didn't happen, as the story tells us, but importantly, for us, it makes us realize what the outcome is that they're desiring for Paul, is they want him dead. If they can make this charge stick, then Paul can be executed for violating the one crime the Jews can actually punish you for with death. So it's clear what their objectives are. They hate Paul, they want him dead, and this is going to be the best opportunity for them to do that. And so they come up with this trumped up charge against Paul, and so they start shouting from the rooftops, look at what this guy Paul has done. Now, everybody is already suspicious about Paul. Many of them already hate him. All they're looking for is an excuse to do away with him. And this seems to be the perfect reason for that. So what we get now is the beginning point, the escalation of, from this point on, for the next 4 years of Paul's imprisonment. What it begins with is a charge of Paul violating Jewish law. So the initial arrest, the initial turmoil that Paul faces comes about again because of a Jewish rule, a Jewish law that is only applicable within Jerusalem and is enforceable by the Jews, but is of really no concern to the Romans. That's a significant issue, or a serious issue that Paul finds himself in, but they've got to make it stick. And that's the key thing. They need to be able to make this charge stick in order for the outcome that they desire, which is for Paul to be executed. Now, that's, of course, easier said than done. So as the story goes on, verse 30 says, "Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. As they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He once took his soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune, they stopped beating Paul." All right, so we've got a pretty crazy situation that has emerged now. We've got a riot that's begun based on these false charges. Now, of course, in a riot in the middle of a mob, there's no sensibility, right? Nobody knows what's going on. It's a mob, right? It's just crazy crowd, craziness, violence. No one's got any idea why they're there. All they can see is there's a big commotion, and so everybody wants to go and see what's happening, and they're hearing hearsay throughout the crowd of what's going on, and they don't even know who's necessarily involved, but everything is getting out of hand. And so naturally within a situation like that, things can really escalate or devolve very, very quickly. And in this case, what it's looking like is that Paul's going to get beaten to death, right? There's a mob around him. Now, again, look, I've never been beaten to death, but I imagine that if there's, hundreds of people around me and they're all trying to punch me and kick me and carry on, I'm not going to last very long. So it's interesting in the story then that the tribune of the cohort, the Roman authority in the region, is able to get down there quickly enough in order to be able to stop it. Now, again, if you've got hundreds of people trying to kill you, you're not going to last very long. I mean, probably a matter of minutes. And so the fact that the Romans were able to get down there so quickly and to be able to put an end to it, at least to be able to calm the crowd down enough that they could get Paul out of it, that's quite significant. Like, how does that actually occur? Well, again, if you look at your diagram of the temple, what you notice next to it, right, literally attached to the temple walls, is what's known as the Fortress of Antonia. Now, this fortress is kind of like an offshoot of the temple. It's like this additional building facility that's built onto the edge of the temple. And it's called the Fortress of Antonia. It's named after Mark Antony. And it was where what hosted a Roman garrison. So there was a whole sort of Roman cohort of soldiers whose job it was to protect or to at least keep the peace in Jerusalem. And remember, Jerusalem is a very unique city in that it's the one city that just never surrenders to Roman authority. They don't fight back because the Romans are too powerful, but they never accept it at the same time. They're never content with the Romans being there. So there's always trouble. And if ever there's going to be riots, they're going to happen in Jerusalem. And if they're going to happen in Jerusalem, they're specifically going to happen at the temple. That's the place where all of these troubles are going to emerge if there's going to be troubles. So it's very important then for the Romans to have a military presence right there in the immediate vicinity of the temple. In fact, you would have seen every day around the walls of Jerusalem were Roman guards. You would have seen Romans patrolling the walls of the temple, constantly watching it for any sort of signs of trouble. So the fact that this mob riot has occurred and the fact that they could deal with it so quickly was because there would have been people probably watching it unfold. They would have heard the crowd starting to get riled up. They would have seen the crowd starting to grow. They would have looked down and realized something is happening here. That would have got their attention. And then they would have signaled straight away for some others soldiers to be able to come down and put an end to this. So all of that happens very quickly. And that's exactly what the job of the Romans was to make sure that you don't get any sort of rebellions or insurrections like you see there. And so this tribune of the cohort, we find out later on that his name is Claudius Lysias, and there's some significance to the name. We will deal with that in another episode. But Claudius Lysias, he's the guy that's in charge of all of this. Now, his job is, he's not the governor of the region. Now, think about Pontius Pilate back in Jesus' day. The governor of the region is based back in Caesarea. So Caesarea is sort of another city further, sort of northwest on the coast. That's where the Roman governor for the region resides, right? Nothing to do with Jerusalem. But he's always got present in Jerusalem this military cohort, probably of about 1,000 soldiers, so quite a significant force, always on hand, specifically based in the temple for such events as these. So Claudius Lysias, this tribune of the cohort, his job is not to act as the governor, right? He can't make any sort of judicial decisions. His job is simply to keep the peace. That's his sole job. So he's got his military guys there for the purposes of keeping the peace. And that's it. That's his one task, right? If you fail at that task, you failed at the entirety of your job. That's going to be, at the very least, you're going to get fired, but if not, much, much worse if you fail in that task. So this is his whole job. Keeping the peace. Well, right now we've got a situation where the peace is definitely not being kept. And so it's his job to get down there and put an end to this as soon as possible. And so then he gets down and puts an end to this straight away. And it's quite a funny picture. You've got this crowd beating the hell out of Paul, and then they see the Romans come down. They're like, everybody just stops beating and sort of maybe starts walking away like nothing's happened. Like, yeah, I would, just sort of going about my day, doing my shopping. And then as he's going through the crowd, he probably finds Paul down there, beaten and bloodied and lying on the ground, just thinking, all right, who is this guy? What on earth is going on? So for the rest of the story, as far as Jerusalem is concerned, the rest of the story is kind of like one of these unfolding mysteries. It's we know the circumstances, we sort of know where the story is going, but for Claudius, it's almost like investigative work. He needs to start to unpack or unfold now what on earth is going on, because he's got to give a report. Well, number one, if this is going to escalate, if there's something that needs to be done about this guy that they're beating, well, he needs to be able to figure out what that is so as to be able to if and when the governor has to intervene in terms of maybe bringing legal charges, he's got to be able to have something to bring to the governor. He's got to, first of all, figure out what's going on so that we don't have this happen again, but figure out what's going on now so that if further action needs to be taken, what is that action? And then first, based on, well, what on earth is going on in the first place? So he's got a very, very unenviable job here. He's got to go into this crowd of people who themselves don't know what's going on. They're just a crazy mob. They've just come in for all the fun and the action just to see what all of the kerfuffle was about. They actually don't know what's going on. So he's got to turn to this crowd, and anyone in that crowd who does know Paul or does really know what's going on hates Paul. And so they're not going to be telling the story from Paul's point of view. They're going to be telling it in any way that's going to get this Roman to come along to their side and to deal with Paul the way that they want it to be done. So he's got to sort of somehow, in the midst of all of this craziness, unpack the story, try to figure out what on earth is taking place here in order for him to be able to make any sort of sense of the situation so that he can make a determination of what needs to happen next. And so he turns around to the crowd, verse 33, and says, "Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he had come to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, 'Away with him.'" All right, so we'll finish the story here, at least for today, and leave it in this moment of tension where Paul has been arrested. He's now been arrested by the Romans, but the job of Claudius, again, is to figure out what's going on. And as far as everyone's concerned at this point, it's this charge that Paul has brought Gentiles into the temple. That's where the story is to this point, at least as far as everyone's understanding is concerned. That, and of course, is a crime, and that's something that if they can make that stick, that's something that Paul can be executed for. For the rest of the crowd, again, they've got no idea what this is all about. It was just a moment of crazy fun. They just wanted to come and see what was going on. So Paul is in a pretty dire situation. If this crowd can get their way, he won't see the end of the day. Like this is something that he can be executed for. This is a really, really bad situation he finds himself in. Now, of course, this is not the reason why he ends up in a prison in Rome, but it's the starting point to the rest of the story, which is his arrest and to ultimately not just clearing his name of these false charges, but to try to come to a place of getting himself out of this situation overall. Whatever, even if the charges are hard to prove, he's still under arrest. Something has been caused by this guy, and so we need to at least figure out what that is. Who is this guy, and why does everybody want him dead so badly? So he's still got a lot of work to do in terms of trying to get himself out of this situation. And again, this simple little misunderstanding or false accusation is going to lead to the next 4 years of Paul's life. It's really quite a remarkable escalation of where we go from here. So again, we'll leave the story here for today. And what we'll look at next week is the interrogation. What is it that actually comes to be the final charge against Paul and what it is that sort of unfolds into the rest of this story. But where we leave ourselves is Paul being dragged up these stairs because, just to finish our passage here, the crowd shouting away with him. They don't even know necessarily who he is, or most of them don't know what he's done, but what they do know is that this is somebody who they need to get rid of. And so Luke finishes this part of the story quite nicely with a sort of a reflection back on Jesus. If you remember when Jesus was being charged and brought before Pilate, what do they shout out when Pilate says, should I crucify your king? They say, no, away with him, crucify him. So what Luke is sort of doing is drawing on that story, that memory, and saying, Paul, in the same situation, same crowd, same response. It's all just a continuation of what we first saw in the life of Jesus. So that's where we're going to leave Paul, and we'll pick it up next week and look at, what happens next, but particularly how this interrogation unfolds. So join me for that. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week.